Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by C2ES. I hope you're all having a nice Wednesday. My name is Amy Bailey. I'm the Director for Sustainability and Engagement here at C2ES, and I'm excited to join you all for a conversation on scaling your renewable energy strategy. We have a great lineup of speakers for today's topic, but before I get to that, I just want to take a quick moment to introduce C2ES. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions is an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit that regularly ranks among the top environmental think tanks in the world. Our work strives to mitigate and prepare for the impacts of climate change, often leveraging market-based mechanisms, and we engage policymaking at every level, from international down to the local level. We work hard to bring public and private sector leaders and other stakeholders just to the same table to understand and advance solutions. It's a quick little intro about who we are. You may have joined us for previous webinars, and we're glad to have you here today. Naturally, the deployment of clean energy technologies are a central solution to the challenge of climate change, and over time we've seen the corporate sector step up to embrace this solution. So I'm glad to have with us today two leaders from the private sector, Scott Hassell from Fifth Third Bank and Ramé Hemstreet of Kaiser Permanente, to share the ways their companies are transforming their organizational footprints. Now, to preview the flow of today's conversation, I'll give a few minutes of introduction to the topic, and then we'll hear from Scott and Ramé about how their companies are using renewables and other clean energy technologies to tackle their organizational footprint. There are some similarities and differences in their approach, and we'll have a brief conversation after Ramé's presentation before we open up to your questions. And now that many of you are logged on, I do want to mention that we will be taking your questions via the chat box in the control panel, or I'm sorry, the question box in the control panel, which is probably opened up there on the right side of your screen. And just note that all attendees are muted, so this chat box and question box are your best ways to communicate with us. So to kick off today's webinar with some foundational information on renewables and the role they are playing globally and in the US and among corporations specifically, I want to share a few slides here. Here you can see from the US Energy Information Administration figure on the right, the sources contributing to US total energy consumption. And two things to note here. Our consumption tends to be leveling out a little bit, but a trend I really want to point out is that of the increasing importance of renewable sources. That's the part shown in green there. In 2018, renewable energy sources accounted for about 11% of total US energy consumption. But when we look solely at electricity generation, that share is about 17%. And expanding out to a global view and also thinking about the future, we can look at the International Energy Agency's recent market analysis and forecast. Their analysis on renewable energy technologies and energy shed some light on the global trends and anticipated developments for renewable energy in electricity, heat, and transport sectors. And so they did a forecast for the next 5 years, basically, from 2018 to 2023, and divided it into two categories. The main forecast, one in which we have the prevailing market and policy framework, renewable capacity is expected to grow over 1 terawatt. That's a 46% growth over the next 5 years, with PV accounting for more than half of this expansion. But the IEA also looked at an accelerated case forecast and found that renewable capacity could grow by, it could be 25% higher by 2023 if we had more governments addressing policy, regulatory, and financial challenges before 2020. So there's kind of a look at some of the potential there. Now, when we're also thinking about why this is happening, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, recently reported the latest trends for the main renewable power technologies and found that costs from all commercially available renewable power generation technologies actually declined in 2018. And in fact, onshore wind and solar PV are set by 2020 to consistently offer a less expensive source of new electricity than the least cost fossil fuel alternative, and that's without financial assistance. So that's an interesting takeaway there. Of course, there are several drivers for this, as you can see there on the right. And since we're speaking with corporate leaders in today's conversation, I want to focus in on the influence of the private sector. And, you know, for some of you, it may be no surprise, we're finding that corporate demand for renewable electricity is driving investment in renewables and can accelerate the global energy transformation. For example, in 2016, a global look at company targets found that 50 companies had already achieved their targets of 100% renewable electricity. That represented a total of 11 terawatt hours of renewable electricity. And in the US, 2018 was a record-setting year for corporate procurement of renewables. This was likely driven by corporate off-takers that were taking advantage of the investment tax credit and production tax credits before the value of those goes down over the next couple of years. But I think, you know, looking at who this is driven by, technology and data companies are making up the largest segment of renewable off-takers. Facebook, Google, Amazon representing a combined 35% of the share of the renewables market is a notable fact there. But of course, we're going to show in this conversation today with a financial institution and a healthcare company, the interest extends far past tech. But what do these trends mean for global climate goals? Well, IRENA also looked at what the overall global share of renewables in total electricity use would need to reach in order to achieve the climate objectives set in the Paris Agreement. And they found that that will have to be at least 85% by 2050. And one thing to note here in this chart, you can see in 2017, it's estimating that corporations accounted for a fraction of the renewable energy demand. And by 2050, corporations will have a large gap to fill to meet growing energy demand with a dominant share of renewable energy. So what they're finding here is that in the current trajectory, this goal is not achievable, but there are plenty of forces and actors that are pushing to make that so. So how will this happen? Well, we know that corporate renewable energy sourcing will need to go beyond the electricity sector and focus on all end uses as well as energy efficiency measures. And so, you know, I want to spend just a minute thinking about one place where this could expand. First, there's growing understanding that if we are to keep the world to a 2-degree warming path, then we will need to, 1, expand our use of existing solutions, and 2, develop solutions to challenges like thermal energy demand. So before I wrap up this introduction, I do want to take a few minutes to talk about renewable thermal. A few baseline facts. Energy used for heating and cooling accounts for half of total global energy demand and 39% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. In the US, heating and cooling account for more than half or more than a quarter of energy use across residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, costing the US $270 billion a year. But renewable thermal technologies will be a key tool to fill this gap. Despite significant potential to reduce those emissions, though, the use of renewable energy for heating and cooling has received relatively little attention compared to renewable electricity. So in response to that dearth of focus, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative was created, and this is a group of organizations from the public, private, and nonprofit world that aims to tackle the long neglected challenges of reducing emissions from energy used for heating and cooling. Called the RTC, this group's strategy is to replicate the success that has occurred in the renewable electricity markets, meaning that's where buyers have used their market demand to influence or drive down prices, simplify access, and scale deployment of renewable tech. The RTC has already become a leading coalition for organizations that are committed to scaling up renewable heating and cooling. And if you are interested in getting involved with this initiative, you can, and there is contact information there at the bottom of the slide. So in support of its goal, the RTC has already identified 6 priority areas to expand and accelerate the renewable thermal energy market for everyone. Those are listed here in no particular order. And you can actually access the full statement there at the link at the bottom of the screen. You can also check out the RTC's webinar about the buyer statement, where members share their experiences working on these issues. It's a really interesting topic. And if you're interested in any of this stuff, the information's there on the screen, and you can also join other organizations as a signatory to this statement as well. So again, since this is a conversation about expanding your renewable energy strategy, I just wanted to mention renewable thermal as one additional avenue that companies are exploring, but there are many ways to do this, whether it's entering into comprehensive purchase agreements or pursuing a portfolio of technologies and financing mechanisms to facilitate adoption. So with that foundation, I'd like to hand over the reins to Scott Hassell of Fifth Third Bank to tell us how Fifth Third is taking on this challenge.
All right, thank you so much, Amy. We greatly appreciate it, and thank you to C2ES for this opportunity. My name is Scott Hassell. I'm the Director of Environmental Sustainability at Fifth Third, and I'm excited to share our approach to scaling renewable energy and with a little bit of a focus on building internal support for a virtual PPA here at Fifth Third Bank. Next slide just shows kind of our footprint. We operate retail banking centers in 10 states, from the Midwest down to the Southeast, and we have commercial banking facilities in other locations as well. And so that's just a quick introduction to Fifth Third. Next slide. And this shows that Fifth Third seeks to be a sustainability leader. That's really where this all begins for us, is that we want to be a leader. Our vision for the entire company is to be the one bank people most value and trust. And we believe that sustainability leadership is a key way to helping to achieve that vision. It's also a key way to engage our employees and to serve our communities. This isn't something that we've just started recently. In 2010, we started purchasing 2% RECs. That was partly through the US EPA Green Power Partnership and LEAD. That's kind of how we stumbled into things. But then within a couple of years, we increased that to 30%, again, partly because of the Green Power Partnership. But doing annual purchases of unbundled RECs was never, we always knew that wasn't where we wanted to end up. We wanted to do more. And so we had our first internal meeting talking about power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements in 2014. And that helped us get an appreciation for some of the complexities, and we thought we weren't quite ready to pursue that, so we kept monitoring what was going on, and we had our second meeting in 2016 on PPAs and virtual PPAs, and we thought it was worth finding a partner to collaborate with and figure out if this was going to be doable. And so that's when we started working with a buyer's agent. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. And as we worked through that process and our other existing sustainability efforts, we set our first public sustainability goals in mid-2017. And because of the due diligence that we'd done on the PPA, we included a 100% renewable power goal. All of these goals shown on this chart are to be achieved by 2022, and you'll see there's landfill waste reduction, water use reduction of 20%, energy use and greenhouse gas reductions of 25%, and then 100% renewable power. So the 100% we were really excited about. That was the toughest sell internally, but if you go to the next slide, you can see part of why we decided to include 100%. And as you can see in this chart, we watched all the PPAs that were growing. I think everyone's seen those deal charts, but we were looking specifically at other U.S. banks and which ones had set 100% goals. And there were many banks that had set 100% goals. They didn't necessarily say how they were going to achieve them, whether it was unbundled RECs or PPAs, but they had set goals of 2020, 2022, and we decided we wanted to be right there in that group because we wanted to be a leader, and specifically we wanted to do it through a PPA that would lead to a new project being built. So next slide talks a little bit about why a PPA. Well, first we knew that a PPA could get us to 100% in a way that doing solar on an individual branch one by one could not. We have over 1,200 branches. We lease office buildings, many of which don't have much roof space, certainly not relative to the consumption. And so we saw that a PPA was a way to really demonstrate leadership and to make quick progress. And we saw it had a number of other benefits as well. Reputationally, it could give us that opportunity to be a sustainability leader. It could demonstrate to socially responsible and ESG investors, as well as our customers and our employees, that we were taking this seriously and that we really did want to do something impactful. And then it could also help us with the CDP, we felt. Not so much because of the numbers itself, but because of the types of internal collaboration and engagement that would happen through the PPA that we could then use towards broader collaboration on sustainability. So we saw the ways that it could help in a number of ways on the CDP. Environmentally, of course, this is going to lead to a big environmental impact by building a new large renewable project. We wanted it to be in our footprint. We're a regional bank. We like to make sure that the economic impact that we have is within our footprint. And then economically for the company as well, this was a way to reduce that annual expense of unbundled RECs. And through analysis, we also saw that this could provide a positive net present value for the company. We did a lot of analysis, and we know that it could be positive. No one knows what the future will be. And then we also saw it as a way to raise awareness about new business opportunities. Fifth Third actually loans for solar and renewable energy, and so this was another way to highlight the fact that this was actually a business that we were already in. And then, of course, there's some risk management benefits. We basically now have a fixed price for carbon-free electricity, and that provides a partial hedge for our electricity spend. That's not one of the primary reasons we did this project, but it was another benefit. Next slide. So having formally set a goal to purchase 100% by the year 2022, and having already started working with a buyer's advisor, you see Schneider Electric's logo at the bottom here, we continued working through this opportunity. And so the way that we did that was we had a 5-person team that really drove internal planning, communications, and coordination. We had 2 executive sponsors that helped us engage other executives and their teams. Schneider Electric, as I mentioned, was an instrumental partner in all of this in terms of bringing their expertise, a process that they had used many times, and they were able to help us and all of my internal stakeholders answer numerous questions as we went through it. And internally, we ended up engaging about 65 internal partners across 11 different divisions by the time we signed the power purchase agreement in December of 2017. So just just a huge number of internal partners. And I think some key strategies that helped us succeed is that we asked everyone, is this a good business decision for the bank? And the goal was to have a candid conversation about that and reach the right answer, because we wanted to build trust even if the answer was no. And that's because we had until 2022 to achieve our goals. And so we thought it was a lot more important to always build trust than to get to yes. Because if this whole cycle, if a whole RFP cycle didn't succeed, we would much rather have created a partnership with our colleagues and identified the real issue so that we could work through it over time and then take another stab at it later. So next slide shows just a high-level visual of the competitive RFP process that we ran with Schneider. Again, they helped us issue the RFP. We got 112 projects back from the RFP. We narrowed it down to 15 and then to 5. We did in-person interviews with those 5 and then did negotiations to choose our final selection. Then we had a number of negotiations on contracts for the PPA itself, as well as the consent agreement, which was related to financing, which was a little more complicated since we're a bank. And then another critical partner in all of this was K&L Gates, which served as our external counsel. The partner, the renewable energy developer that we selected was Sun Energy One, based in North Carolina, and kudos to them for working with us and all of the external counsels to work through a lot of unique contract requirements that were specific to us being a bank and us being a swap dealer specifically. Virtual power purchase agreements are a type of derivative contract, and that's an easily manageable thing for many companies, but it's a little more complicated when you're a regulated swap dealer. So again, kudos to all those partners that helped us work through that process and sign a contract on December 1st of 2017. Having signed that contract, next slide, we then realized how momentous our accomplishment had been and realized we needed to figure out how to communicate that. And so we started with a press release, which everybody starts with, but then we really reached out and engaged our corporate communications colleagues and a number of others to figure out how do we tell the story in a really interesting and compelling way. So with their help, we developed a nice infographic that you see on the right, and then we also developed a video, which I encourage you to go watch at 53.com/sustainability, that told our story about being the first bank to contract for 100% solar power. And so, yeah, I kind of left that big takeaway off at the slide a couple minutes ago, where our ultimate selection was to go with 100% solar power, which really put us in that's the first bank, first publicly traded company to commit to 100% solar. So that was very exciting. That's why we developed all these assets. And then we wanted a way to really make a big splash. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see that we actually announced the PPA at NASDAQ with the opening bell in March of 2018. And so you see that picture in the upper left. And it was just a fabulous way to continue to engage our management. We had our chief financial officer ring the opening bell, and it led to just an enormous wave of coverage from traditional media, on social media. We also had, working with Sun Energy One, our partner, we also had a symbolic groundbreaking at the project in North Carolina. And next slide. And we're very excited that the project is under construction and will be completed in 2019. So stay tuned for more announcements. And I'm just going to wrap up with the last slide on some lessons learned that I wanted to share with you all. To hopefully make this easier for others that are looking to follow in a similar path. So the first insight really is work with your manager to brief key leaders on why you should set a 100% renewable energy goal and recruit an executive sponsor. The executive sponsor is just critical to being able to set a goal, to establish the legitimacy of the goal, and to keep it a priority among all of the other competing priorities that large organizations have. I'd also encourage you to set a renewable energy goal that requires you to start now, but allows you to recover from some delays. And that's important because it allows you to identify and address key issues rather than try to force people to say yes to difficult questions. Again, the goal should be to build trust. And the other benefit is that when surprises occur, when you try pathways that don't work out, it's much easier to go back to those partners who helped you choose that first pathway and say, you know what, we tried this. It didn't work. Let's work together and try to find another way forward. And so again, you've been able to build trust and collaboration, which is what we need to succeed on this, as well as other sustainability issues. At the same time, it was really helpful that we had an RFP process that was ongoing because it created urgency, it created specifics that we could analyze, and it used people's time efficiently. Again, we were always willing to walk away if we found that this RFP process or if we found a barrier that we couldn't overcome, but that urgency created a timeline that let everyone know that we were using their time well, and it allowed the executive sponsors to stay engaged and help engage their peers when we had questions and needed help. Another item is that cross-cutting projects have to survive or pass a number of formal and informal vetting processes. And I think the informal processes are the most difficult, especially for something as innovative as a virtual power purchase agreement. And so something that really helped us was learning from the individuals that had run cross-cutting efforts in the past. So think of, a corporate rebranding effort. Go talk to the people who were involved in that. Learn from the executives. Find out if they're project managers that help with those kinds of big, complicated corporate priorities, because they're going to help you navigate those complexities of the formal and informal processes. And then finally, recognize that a successful PPA evaluation process, almost regardless of whether you get a PPA, is going to open the door to broader internal collaboration. So those are some key lessons, and I'm going to wrap it up there and hand it back to you, Amy.
Thank you, Scott. And as a reminder to everyone joining us today, a video of this webinar will be shared after we wrap up and also posted on C2ES's YouTube channel. So please look for it there. And if you have any questions, we're tracking along as the webinar progresses. If you have your drop down in the questions box there on your control panel, you can add your questions for us there. We'll get those at the end of the presentation. So with that, I want to introduce Ramé Hemstreet, the Vice President of Operations and Chief Sustainable Resources Officer at Kaiser Permanente, to share a little bit about what Kaiser Permanente is up to in this space. Ramé, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks everyone for joining us. A tremendous presentation, Scott. I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on some examples highlighting some of the points that Amy and Scott made. Our journey has been remarkably similar to Scott's in terms of virtual PPAs, so I won't trod the same path there that he just did, but I'll just highlight a couple of differences with the work we've done. So if you go to the first slide there, Amy. In our organization, as far as building consensus, it's probably been an easier journey than most have there. This is really part of our mission. Our mission statement includes improving the health of the communities we serve, and there's no more consequential health issue in the 21st century than climate change. So essentially, we've committed to do what physicians have been committed to for over 2,000 years, to do no harm and to eliminate our contribution to climate change by 2020. So you see our CEO, Bernard Tyson, speaking there at the Global Climate Action Summit, at which we made that commitment to carbon neutrality by next year. Now, of course, we'd already done a lot of preparatory work to enable us to make that commitment just last year for a goal that was only 2 years away at the time. So how are we going to get there? If you go to the next slide, Amy. This is a waterfall chart that shows the sources of our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and then the various actions we're taking to eliminate or offset those emissions. So on the far left there is the thermal footprint that we have from our central utility plant. So that is utilizing natural gas in our hospitals to make hot water, steam, in some cases chilled water and electricity. Then we have other scope 1 sources, such as fleet vehicles, some medical gases that escape, a few other things. We have the odd situation in Hawaii where we purchase a lot of electricity. We do a lot of on-site solar there, but the state confiscates the RECs in Hawaii. So therefore, we have to find a way to offset all of our electricity consumption in Hawaii. And then we have the remainder of our purchased electricity, that largest gray block there. So over the last few years, and what really enabled us to make that announcement last year, or that commitment last year, has been entering into what are generally called virtual PPAs, what we call renewable product agreements. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We've also done a lot of on-site solar. Now, to Scott's point, the opportunity there is limited by the number of parking lots and roofs that you have, but we have done on-site solar at scale, and we continue to add more and more to that inventory. Then wherever it's cost competitive, we enter into green tariff agreements with community energy companies, as well as our providers such as Puget Sound Electric that offers a green tariff. We also have offset our anesthesia emissions to some extent by implementing low carbon anesthesia. And finally, the last pieces of the puzzle that we're going to put into place by the end of the year is purchasing carbon offsets to compensate for those scope 1 emissions, and to purchase some unbundled RECs for those cases where we have not yet been able to either consummate a off-site solar deal or install enough on-site solar generation. We hope to, within the next couple of years, eliminate that last red bar there and incorporate it into the first 2 green bars, as we will probably do one more virtual PPA and then continue to add to our on-site inventory. But really going forward, our major emphasis will be on thermal renewables, and we intend to join the RTC. So, I think increasingly you'll see as companies become 100% renewable electricity, it won't just be us switching the focus to thermal renewables, but this industry switching focus there. For those of us who made early commitments and also are lucky enough to be located primarily in a state like California, about 2/3 of our consumption is here. It facilitates the renewable electricity purchases, but eliminating those scope 1 emissions will remain a conundrum probably for decades, but one that we're going to try to tackle. Next slide. So this shows all of the major commitments we've made, all of the deals that have gone to our board of directors, both for on-site solar purchases. We've also done, we've installed a lot of fuel cells at our facilities. And then at the bottom there are those structured renewable energy agreements, the virtual PPAs, 2 of which were consummated back in 2014 and have been in operation for a couple of years now. And then 2 more that were completed in summer of last year. Those projects have yet to begin construction, and they'll start generating electricity in 2021 timeframe. We are going to receive RECs equivalent to the expected output of those projects beginning this year. So that'll help enable our 2020 carbon neutrality goal attainment. So a little bit more about those last two projects there. If you go to the next slide, the Arlington Solar project is quite unique. So there, it's 131 megawatts of new renewable energy generation that we are purchasing. We went through exactly the same thought process, really, as Scott described, and much the same procurement process that he described. The only difference is we did it with our internal resources. We have a robust procurement department. I have a lot of experience in purchasing various things, and our assistant treasurer was a key partner. So other than a couple of tasks that we outsourced to do some analytical work, and our external counsel, who was a key member of the team, we consummated these deals ourselves. The latest deal is not only 131 megawatts of solar generation, but also 110 megawatts of 4-hour battery storage. So this is going to be one of the largest solar plus storage projects in the country. We did it because it makes financial sense given the increasing penetration of solar here in California, and the fact that certain seasons and certain times of the day, solar has to be curtailed. Essentially, there's more production than the grid can accommodate. So doing some analysis, we think that the arbitrage value of that electricity is going to more than compensate for the additional amortized cost of the batteries that we're going to be paying for there. And, you know, in addition to being smart financially, we think this just further demonstrates our commitment to a 100% renewable future for at least the state of California. Obviously, as we increase the penetration of renewables that Amy described at the beginning, we have to increase the amount of storage capability to accommodate the intermittency of most of that renewable production. Next slide. So this is just a little bit about our on-site solar generation. Again, we're doing this at scale, so that reduces the unit cost. We already have more than 35 megawatts on site, and we have at least that amount in the pipeline over the next couple of years as we finish up every viable location that we have in our inventory. So while this will still peak out at about 10% of our total electricity requirement, you know, we think it is a visible demonstration of our commitment. And of course, it also provides a nice sunshade for folks when they're in our parking lots. Next slide. And finally, as I mentioned, we've also installed a lot of fuel cells. Now, fuel cells are not zero carbon, and depending on where you're located, they're not necessarily even a lower carbon alternative to purchasing electricity from the grid. They do have a lower SOx and NOx emission than peaking plants tend to, so there is a health benefit there. But we've installed the fuel cells primarily as a cost-saving measure over time to eliminate T&D costs, and also to, you know, we think we're able to lock in the tolling rate for those fuel cells, so it gives us some pricing stability over the long term compared to being 100% in the market for just buying electricity. And also here in California, there are subsidies offered for energy storage. So we are, in addition to that large-scale energy storage that will be adjacent to our latest virtual PPA, we've been installing behind-the-meter energy storage that will, again, enable California to achieve its goal 25 years from now to be 100% renewable or clean energy, I should say, and also provide us the opportunity to arbitrage the energy and peak shave. So let me stop there and turn it back to Amy to MC the questions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ramé. So I have a couple of questions that I just wanted to ask you both. Starting with Scott, can you explain a little bit more on how you decided on the scale for your project and that contract? And, you know, you went all the way with your RFP instead of breaking it down into smaller pieces. Can you just describe how that conversation went and the thinking behind that?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. There's a few reasons that we kind of worked through simultaneously, especially as we started going through the process and then had to go back and kind of repeat some parts. And the key pieces are that, you know, one, we are not as large of an energy user as many companies. And so as we looked at our total consumption, and as we looked, working with Schneider on, you know, how big the projects were that were out there, and where you could kind of get the best pricing, we felt like we were tempted to say let's try to go ahead and do everything in one project. The other reasons were that as a bank and as a swap dealer, and I know I mentioned a little bit of that already, so I don't want to repeat it too much, but we realized that we were going to have a number of unique contracting requirements that wouldn't apply to other banks that weren't regulated as swap dealers. And so we knew that was going to be complicated and involve a lot of kind of one-off work, both for us as well as for everyone that was working with us. So that really helped convince us that we wanted to try to do this in a single project. And as long as we could do it within our footprint, we felt like that was the right way to go forward and really provide that bold leadership that we were seeking, again, because we wanted to come out with a bold statement to drive all of our sustainability efforts forward, including, you know, what does it really mean for a bank to become sustainable? What does it mean for us to understand about lending and risk and opportunities? And so we wanted this to drive a broader conversation internally, and we thought 100% was the way to do that.
Great, thank you. And Ramé, kind of the opposite question for you. The company's taking a very tailored approach to reducing impacts. So can you talk to us about the benefit of pursuing a variety of solutions and maybe some of the challenges of doing it in that approach?
Yeah, well, some of it was just timing and sort of the progression of our goals. You know, we had at one point a 30% carbon emissions reduction goal. So that caused the sizing of those first virtual PPAs. You know, we've always wanted to find solutions that we think, you know, that qualify as additional renewable assets. So therefore, we wanted to first maximize our on-site capacity, and you know, we spent, although the impact is less than those virtual PPAs, probably the effort there is 10 times what we put into the virtual PPAs, because of course there's a lot of disruption to existing operations when you do that. But you know, those are most obviously, you know, those directly reduce our consumption of electricity that comes from fossil fuel sources. So we really wanted to focus our efforts there first and see how far that could get us. And then with this latest renewable energy project, you know, that was sized in order to get us to 100% renewable energy in California. You know, I would emphasize that, you know, we've taken the approach that we don't want to do virtual PPAs that are not located in the same market in which we consume electricity, because that would, by having the two in the same market, we've proved the point that we surmised when we went into this, that it's a pretty effective hedge. But if you're in two different markets, we doubt that that hedge would be as nearly as effective.
Great, thank you. And just another question from me before we skip over to our audience questions. For both of you, I'm wondering about your Scope 3 emissions. I think these are often the next frontier of challenges for companies working to reduce impacts. How are your institutions thinking about Scope 3, and are renewable energy solutions kind of in that toolkit of potential solutions to those challenges?
So I'm sorry, Scott, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ramé.
Well, I was just going to say, in order to attain our carbon neutral certification next year, we are going to, our carbon offset purchases will include our business travel. As far as our supply chain, we already have some procurement policies in place that are not requirements yet, but certainly state a strong preference for our supply chain to align with the practices that we've put in place for our own business. So I think once we get all the way there next year and go through a lot of the public relations that Scott described around attaining carbon neutrality for Scope 1 and Scope 2, we will turn our attention to the supply chain and, as you suggest, perhaps look at partnering with our supply chain on some of those renewable purchases that akin to what we've done.
Yeah, great answer. And from the Fifth Third perspective, we're certainly thinking about Scope 3, and I think one of the things that I mentioned, but maybe not as explicitly enough, was all the work that we went through internally to get this approved, the work to communicate it. Communicating it internally is just as important, maybe even more important than the external communications, because we want all of our employees to realize that we're being a bold sustainability leader, because then when we try to engage people throughout the organization, whether it's recycling or it's procurement improvements, they're going to know this is part of who Fifth Third is. We are an environmental sustainability leader. And so that is really important for all those Scope 3 emissions, whether it's sourcing or business travel, or in the case of financial institutions, financed emissions are one of those Scope 3 categories. And I think everyone in the financial sector is looking at that and trying to figure out what does that mean. There are a number of efforts being developed to try to tackle it, but it is a very difficult, complicated challenge. And so, and it's one that lands right on the financial sector. So I think the PPA has really helped us broaden people's perceptions of who our company is and how we go about doing things. And I think that's going to help us in all of these things, whether it's renewable thermal or financed emissions or anything else. So I hope as we get this project completed and communicated that we can tackle all of those things more quickly than we would have otherwise.
Great, thank you. And a question that we're getting from our audience, it centers, and this might actually be coming through from a few folks. Can you both comment on the messaging piece around, are we saying 100% renewable? Are we saying 100% carbon free? Is it carbon neutral? Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the subtleties of some of those word choices?
This is Scott. I'll happily try to take that. It's definitely a challenge. I think, and it's an important challenge. I think part of what I have done in working with all those internal colleagues is help them understand that we need to be very careful and specific about what we've done. Fifth Third, we're always trying to say that we're purchasing 100% renewable power as the kind of headline, and then as we have more opportunity to explain what we've done and can talk about the virtual power purchase agreement, I think people who can parse those differences can see the details. But we try to avoid saying 100% renewable energy. So teaching people that power and energy are different is always challenging. But yeah, we're trying to be specific about what we have done and make it as clear as possible. And so we always are watching what others are doing to try to communicate it, because certainly there's different communication strategies out there. And then for our greenhouse gas goals, so far we have made those just a location-based greenhouse gas reduction goal. I mean, we certainly report our market-based emissions as well, but we think keeping it clear right now is the best approach while we watch what others are doing.
Yeah, I agree. This can be very confusing, and of course, the moment you start trying to explain all the complexities, people tune out, or perhaps think you're just obfuscating and greenwashing. So I'd say, one thing, we're going to do is rely on third-party verification. We're going to hire a third party to do our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and have a third party provide the certification that we've achieved our goal of through a combination of RECs and carbon offsets to get there. Obviously there's disagreement over the validity of carbon offsets, and you can even have disagreements over some of the virtual PPAs, especially if as we're doing, you're arbitraging the value of the so-called Category 1 RECs. But at the end of the day, there are, I think, authoritative third parties that you can turn to adjudicate these things, and that's what we intend to do.
Thanks, Ramé. And 2 follow-up questions for you, if you could maybe quickly take these on. What type of carbon offsets does Kaiser Permanente prefer to invest in, and how is the fuel cell that you're investing in terms of the economics, and thinking about like dollars per kilowatt?
Sure. Yeah, 2 very different questions. So, we just completed a RFP process and a selection process for the carbon offsets, which was a fascinating experience. Obviously, very different than selecting amongst potential renewable energy projects. For us, health co-benefits were an important factor. Eventually, we'd like to get to additionality. So in other words, find projects that are in the initiate phase, and through our commitment to purchasing the eventual offsets, enable those projects to happen. In the short term, most of our carbon offsets will be prior year vintages, so projects that already exist and have gone through the certification process and have approved offsets that they are now selling into the market. So I hope that answers the question on carbon offsets. Obviously, that could be an entire webinar in and of itself. As far as the fuel cells, we negotiated a flat tolling rate for turning natural gas into electricity, and then of course, you have to add the cost of the natural gas to that. We evaluated that versus our current, the avoided cost of the same electricity, and then what our conservative prediction is of what the inflation will be in that over time. Essentially the result, especially in the out years, due to that flat tolling rate, we expect a 3 like $100 million savings over the 15-year term of the agreements. And that's for about 35 megawatts of capable of production.
Thanks. And maybe both of you can comment on PPA sizes, since you both have experience here. We have one listener who is in a small township and wondering whether they can do a PPA for their electricity use or whether they're too small. So maybe you could comment on that.
We've talked to developers about that to find what the sweet spot is and also sort of the minimum. And I've gotten, somewhat conflicting answers, down to as low as 10 megawatts, as much as, 30 megawatts. Would, anything less than that, the price starts going up. It's probably location dependent as well. We have, the industry hasn't, although there are a few examples of success, I don't think we yet have a great model. I know there are some companies out there that are in this space and probably would disagree with me, but we haven't seen it yet as something that would benefit us to consolidate a number of buyers and therefore achieve some economies of scale for those smaller buyers to take advantage of a larger deal, such as we've done or Fifth Third has done. I think that's coming, and there's some intermediaries who are definitely very active in that space that might be able to help that questioner. If they have a smaller requirement than we do, if they're down at 5 or 10 megawatts. What they might want to look at are opportunities to collaborate with similar potential purchasers.
Yeah, I think Ramé's got a great answer there. I think just one or two quick things to add is one way to approach this is to invite multiple of the buyer's advisors in to present to you all and to present, not just to whoever's asking the question, but hopefully some of their internal stakeholders. I know that we did that when we selected Schneider, and it was extremely valuable because it demonstrated that we had done good due diligence in choosing our partner, which helped keep other people engaged and make them realize that we've done it the right way. But then you can also get people to give you, you've got multiple perspectives about, what size is are you big enough for people to even respond and come? And then what do they tell you when they come? And it's also a chance for your colleagues to hear firsthand from multiple firms, what are the issues? And I think one of the things that would have made that hard for us is that we did have unique contracting requirements. And so I think, through aggregation, I suspect you're going to have to end up with more common terms and conditions for these agreements. And so that's probably useful things for your stakeholders to learn is that, if you're going to aggregate, you might need to be more flexible in some of the terms and conditions than you might otherwise, but you actually may get some additional benefits out of that because you've got a bigger contract.
Thanks, Scott. And I just want to kind of piggyback off of this line of question because there's another similar question about the future of funding for renewable projects among local governments. And so I see in this space things are getting a lot more innovative, and there are a lot of different mechanisms or strategies that local governments are using to increase their own portfolios. And it's not always on site generation, but increasingly there's more partnerships with their own utilities. Maybe they're going to take advantage of a green tariff or a green rider with their utility, or a franchise agreement can be another time period where you can get everyone around the table thinking about what kind of energy is sourcing the city. And so there's lots of different paths there. I'll ask one last question here, and then I think we'll close up for the day. Have you kind of sensed a certain positive or negative feedback in terms of going more renewables with more renewables in your portfolios from other corporations? Are you seeing it kind of everyone is accepting this? Is there any pushback? And if there's pushback, how do you deal with that?
No pushback from my perspective, and to Scott's point, I think it's been very positive internally. You know, we have almost 200,000 employees here in California alone, and the response from our internal stakeholders has been very, very positive.
Yeah, I'd second that. I'm amazed at how many employees, you know, within Fifth Third's 18,000 employees know about it and are excited. And certainly the external feedback we've gotten has all been very positive as well, with companies asking, you know, how have we done it? How could they approach it and try to do it themselves? So all positive.
Great. Well, we are right at the hour here, and so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I think we'll conclude there. If you have any questions, of course, you can reach out to us at c2es.org. Just one last reminder, you will get access to this presentation after we conclude, and it will also be up on C2ES's YouTube channel. There might be a little bit of lag time on that as we get the file ready for upload. But thank you all for joining us today, and please have a good rest of your afternoon.